Welcome back. All right, so since this channel came into existence, the Washington Capitals won their first Stanley Cup, and then St. Louis won their first Stanley Cup the year after, and this year it is the Vegas Golden Knights winning their first Stanley Cup, and they intend to win more. They might. We have seen repeat champions as well, Pittsburgh and Tampa Bay as examples. But there are 11 teams in the NHL that have not won a Stanley Cup. And before anybody says anything, no, the Ottawa Senators, this franchise does not have a Stanley Cup win. I'm aware that the Ottawa Senators have banners up. That is the previous Ottawa Senators franchise, which moved to St. Louis, became the Eagles, and then folded. That being said, these are the teams that, if you want to be upset and complain, you may very well be a fan base that has the right if you are a fan of one of these teams. Now, I'm going far more into depth with this than I normally do. Normally, when I do this video, I don't go anywhere near the amount of depth that we're seeing on the board today. And I'm also using timestamps for this because I do anticipate this could end up being one of those longer videos. We're going to start off with Buffalo. There I'm wearing Buffalo because I'd love to see Buffalo win a championship. They haven't made the playoffs since 2011, so that doesn't help. Currently, according to Caesars, the odds of them winning the Stanley Cup, plus 3,000, which sounds like a lot, but they've got better odds than Seattle. They've got better odds than a lot of the other teams on this board. So at the very least, right now, your Cup odds tell you that Caesars kind of likes Buffalo. And again, at this point in time in the year, we haven't even gone through the draft. We haven't gone through free agency. You have to take the odds with a grain of salt. Now, their general manager, Kevin Adams, was hired June 16th of 2020. I think he's done a good job. I think that while, yes, Eichel held up the Stanley Cup and he was against Sam Reinhart in the final, I still think that Adams has done a good job as the general manager. Their coach, Don Granato, hired March 17th of 2021. I think he's been a very good coach for them as well. So I do like the brain trust there in Buffalo. I like the team that they're building. The one question mark is, because if you're looking at a team and whether or not they're going to win the Stanley Cup, a strong GM, which Vegas has had that, good coach, Vegas had that as well, and starting goaltender, Adin Hill, ends up going from the number 4 in the organization to being the starter in the playoffs, but it worked out pretty well. So for Buffalo this coming season, is it going to be Luukkonen? Is it going to be Levi? Could it be Comrie? Sure. Goaltending is one thing they have to straighten out if they're going to have a shot at not only making the playoffs this year, but making some noise. I honestly think that it might be worth it at this point for Buffalo to take Luukkonen, who's a good young goaltender, and say, you know what, we're going to roll the dice, trade Luukkonen out, bring in a veteran presence in the net, and see what happens. Again, I know that sounds completely crazy, but for Buffalo, I do think there's a reason to believe. I'm wearing a Buffalo jersey. I don't know whether or not they actually win one, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I'm a Canucks fan. And the Vancouver Canucks, it's been 52 seasons for them as well. They haven't made the playoffs since 2020. That was the first time they made the playoffs since 2015. Now, they did get through the qualifying round. They got through the first round in 2020. However, it has been setback after setback since then. They're trying to, they're buying out Ekman Larson. The plan then is that they're going to use that money and they're going to probably get more money to use on other players. They want a number 3 center, all that fun stuff. We shall see. The odds plus 6,000, which is pretty common. That seems to be the placeholder for a lot of the teams that missed the playoffs. Patrick Alvin's been GM for about a year and a half. January 26th of 2022, he became the general manager. Jim Rutherford, of course, hiring him. I think Alvin's done a good job in some ways. Other areas I've kind of, been left scratching my head. Rick Tocchet, hired as coach January 22nd, 2023. The worst kept secret in the history of the National Hockey League. Rick Tocchet being hired by the Canucks. But I think he did a good job of getting them to buy into the systems. Whether or not that continues into next season, we shall see. And of course, Demko's the starter. The good news for the Canucks, while Demko had a slow start to the season, by the end he was playing like the Demko we all know and love. So I would love to say I think Vancouver's building to a Stanley Cup, but it feels like that's a little bit premature, just a tad. And so we'll see, right? This season, the plan is to get back into the playoffs. Fingers crossed on that one. I had cautious optimism a couple years ago. Now it's just cautious. It's just a general caution. It's a warning flag, basically. All right, and so we move on to Arizona. Arizona, it's been 43 seasons if you include the Winnipeg Jets, where they have not won a Stanley Cup. They have not appeared in the Stanley Cup final either. So the last time that they were in the playoffs was also 2020 because of the expanded playoffs. If not for the expanded playoffs, we'd be talking about 2012. Arizona has been mediocre for a long time. I do like the rebuild they're in the midst of. They're not ready for a playoff run this coming season in all likelihood. Their odds plus 25,000. So, I mean, yeah, but you're better off keeping your money. I know 25 grand. It's like, hey, I don't see it. Bill Armstrong's been general manager since September 17th of 2020. I think he's done a decent job considering the budget, considering all of the constraints with that team. I think he's done as well as he can. And Andre Tourigny gets more wins out of that group than he should. He was hired July 1st of 2021, so I do like the GM and the coach. Carl Vejmelka gets overrated a little bit. He has these really, really sensational games, usually against really good teams, and then he has mediocre games sprinkled in there as well. So the reality is, he's probably not as good as some think, but he is better than you might give credit for a player in Arizona. I do get a kick out of when people say, well, this guy's totals were down, but he's with the Coyotes. What do you expect? Actually, with Tourney and in general with Arizona, they do a good job of building up the value of players. Gostisbehere's a good example where they built up his value and he went to Carolina. He wasn't as good in Carolina as he was in Arizona. So I don't see Arizona as a contender. I don't see them as the next team to come off the board. So we go to San Jose. San Jose has been in the league 31 seasons without a Stanley Cup. They were in the finals in 2016. Their last run in the playoffs was 2019. They got all the way to the conference final that year. Their odds are seen as plus 20,000. Again, this is from Caesars Sportsbook. BetMGM and Caesars, a little bit different on their odds. Mike Grier was hired as general manager July 5th of 2022, so he's on his one-year anniversary a couple of weeks from now. And it's a rebuild. It's a rebuild. David Quinn behind the bench. He was hired July 21st of 2022. So Quinn's pretty safe in his job because I don't think there's any expectations. And who's their starter? Because Reimer's on an expired contract now, so he's going to go to market. Does Kakinen become the starter? Do they bring up one of the guys from the minors to be the starter? Do they go out and bring in somebody else to be the starter? We're about to find out, I guess. But for San Jose, it does feel like they're down right now. And probably not a good bet to come off the board. And this is the funny thing is, usually when I do this video, there's a team that I can say, hey, this is a good bet. And this team's a decent bet. This time around, there's one that looks like they're close. And the rest of them really don't look that close. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about Ottawa. Ottawa's been in the league 30 years. Their last playoffs were 2017. And the fans are getting a bit of an itch for playoffs now. The frustration level is there, and it should be. Their odds plus 6,000, so the same as Vancouver and the same as a couple others down here. Pierre Dorian's been the GM there since April 10th of 2016. I think Dorian's done a decent job with the rebuild so far. However, the longer it takes for the team to actually come through it and make the playoffs, the more it's going to put pressure on Dorian with his job. And we'll see with new ownership what the expectations are as well. If Michael Andlauer comes in and goes, okay, I expect playoffs this year, and they don't deliver, Dorian's job could be on the line there. DJ Smith, still the coach. May 13th, 2019, he was brought in. There are some who think he does a good job. There are some that thinks he doesn't. And their starting goaltender's kind of a question mark too. Will it be Forsberg in the fall? Odds are they probably go out and get somebody else. Talbot, of course, an expiring contract. He's not coming back. So that brings us to Florida. Florida, and I wish I could give more information for Ottawa, but there really isn't anything else out there at this point. I've talked about Florida a lot, or I've talked about Ottawa a lot lately. Not that I haven't talked about Florida plenty as well. Of course, they were finalists this year. They've been in the league 29 seasons. Their odds are plus 1,000. So their odds are actually pretty good. Comparatively speaking, Colorado's got the best odds at plus 600. Anaheim, the longest shot of longest shots at plus $30,000. So save your money. Anyways, plus 1,000 for Florida, and Bill Zito being brought in as GM September 2nd, 2020. So far, he's done a great job. And Paul Maurice, hey, shut me up. He was hired last year, June 22nd of 2022, and while during the regular season it didn't look like it was clicking, then we get to the playoffs. Oh, it clicked. Once you get to Game 5 against Boston, yeah, things were pretty good from there. And Bobrovsky is the starter. the debate over his contract, he still could end up getting traded this summer. It could happen because they need more cap space for other players. But at this point, I would think of the teams on the board, Florida's in the best position, and not just because they made it to the Stanley Cup final this year, but because they were a President's Trophy winner last year. This is a good, solid, deep team who had a rough regular season and then played like we know they can during the playoffs this season. So I do think of the teams on the board, Florida's the one with the best chance. I think that, CANUCKS taking his game to the next level. They've got an underrated blue line. They're a very fast team, and they are very good at forcing turnovers, great in transition. There's a lot of reasons to like Florida out of the teams on the board. Which brings us to Nashville. Nashville, 24 seasons in the NHL. They were finalists in 2017. They have not been back since. 2018, they were President's Trophy winners. They lost in the second round against Winnipeg that year. Their odds, plus 6,000. So the same odds as Ottawa, the same odds as Vancouver. Barry Trotz is going to be the general manager on July the 1st of this year. That's when he officially takes over. I look forward to seeing what Trotz does. Andrew Burnett is the coach. He was named on May the 31st of this year, I should say. And UC Saros is their starting goaltender. So they have the starting goaltender. This is a team that should bounce back next year. It's not that long ago that they were in the Stanley Cup playoffs last year. And so we'll see whether or not Saros can get them in the playoffs this coming year. Can Forsberg stay healthy? And all of that other fun stuff. Can the veterans continue to play like we know they can? Nashville might be a good bet for a bounce back. So while Florida, to me, is the favorite to come off the board next, Nashville, I wouldn't write off either. I think those are the two more likely. I think they're just really well-run organizations in general, and that is part of the story. I know people look for some kind of a convoluted plot, and, well, the NHL wants this or wants that. You just have really good management and solid rosters. You're going to do well. All right, that being said, Winnipeg, 23 seasons in the NHL. That, of course, includes the Atlanta Thrashers. They were conference finalists in 2018. There has not been a lot of joy in Winnipeg outside of that. Plus 6,000 is their odds as well. So, again, it feels like that's a placeholder number for teams that finished outside the playoffs. Kevin Cheveldayoff has been the GM from day one in Winnipeg, June the 8th of 2011. His job, there has to be at least some risk if the Jets don't make the playoffs next year for him, right? So we're going to see big moves. We're going to see trades with Winnipeg. And you have to think that for Cheveldayoff, this is his chance to show that he can rebuild on the fly, as in it's a rebuild of player for player, and really the goal is to make the playoffs next year. Rick Bowness became coach July 3rd of last year. Bowness is an excellent coach. He can get you all the way to the Stanley Cup final. Absolutely. Can he win in the final? That's the question mark. Hellebuck is currently their starting goaltender, but we know that by the time October rolls around, it'll probably be somebody else. When Hellebuck gets traded, if Hellebuck gets traded, it's possible he doesn't, but he probably does, you have to get a goaltender back. Whether it's in the deal with Hellebuck or whether it's in a different trade you make involving Scheifele, involving whoever, right? Whoever ends up being moved, you have to get a goaltender back. And if this team's going to stay in the playoffs, they have to really go player for player, right? Trade one guy out, bring another guy in, that kind of thing. So we'll see what happens with Winnipeg, but they're going to be an interesting one. Fringe chance that they're the team to come off the board. I would love to see Winnipeg win a Stanley Cup. My wife's a huge fan of Winnipeg, and I've kind of been won over to their story over the last few years. And there are a lot of Winnipeg Jets players that I like quite a bit, so there's that. All right, Columbus. So for the Blue Jackets, 22 years in the NHL. They haven't been in the playoffs since 2020. Their odds, plus 20,000. So what's interesting is that Columbus, coming into this past season, were seen as a team that was going to contend for a playoff spot. They didn't get anywhere near. I honestly think those odds are too low. I think this team will bounce back. It's a matter of how healthy they are. Can Werenski just jump right in October? And how does that new defense gel, right? Because Werenski's missed basically a full season. It's going to be like having a new guy in the lineup, and then they've added on the blue line too. So there's a lot of question marks with Columbus, but if it all falls into place, Jarmo Kekalainen will get the credit. Been general manager since February 13th of 2013. It's challenging to be the GM for that team, but he's done a pretty decent job of it. And currently the head coaching spot is vacant officially. However, the plan seems to be to hire Mike Babcock. So if they hire Babcock, we'll see how that turns out. The starting goaltender currently is Merzlikins. Is it Merzlikins after all is said and done? That's where things get interesting to me as well, because the goaltending wasn't good enough this year for Columbus. You just look at goals saved above expected or below expected, and yeah, Elvis's numbers were kind of scary. So we're going to find out. But then we move on to Minnesota. Came in the same year, so 22 seasons without a cup for Minnesota too. They were conference finalists in 2003. Columbus has never made a conference final. So this is, I mean, we talk about the cursed expansion here, which was Buffalo and Vancouver. Right now, Columbus and Minnesota are in that conversation too. Minnesota's odds are good, plus 2,800. Yeah, they've got better odds than every other team I've talked about thus far, and other than Florida. And honestly, they're given better odds than Seattle, which kind of surprised me when I saw it. So Bill Guerin's been general manager there since August 21st of 2019. The buyouts of Parise and Suter obviously hamstring the franchise at this point, but he's doing his best to build this team. You've got Kaprizov. You've got a pretty good young core there, and so we'll see what they can do. Dean Evison behind the bench since February 14th of 2020, and I mean, Evison terrifies me when he's got that glare going on behind the bench. And so we'll see whether or not Evison and Guerin can get this team over the hump in a playoff run. Gustafsson is likely the starter this year. I'd be very surprised if Fleury gets the starting net more than, say, 30, 35 games this year. I think it's going to be Gustafsson's net. And I like Gustafsson. I kind of like Minnesota's chances a little bit, but that salary cap penalty is hurting them. That's a lot of money. So that's definitely going to hurt their chances of being the next team off the board. Which brings us to what may very well be the next team to come off the board, and that's Seattle. Now, Seattle's only had 2 years in the NHL, but they made it to the second round this year. So of all the teams on the board, you've got missed playoffs, missed playoffs, missed playoffs, no playoffs, no playoffs, Stanley Cup Finals, no playoffs, out in the first round, no playoffs, out in the first round. So Seattle in the second round, they made it further than every other team on this board other than Florida. Their odds plus 3,500, which again to me I was kind of surprised that the odds are as long as they are. Ron Francis has been GM from the start. July 18th of 2019 he was added as GM. And the GM, or the coach for the team, Dave Hackstall, added June 24th of 2021. So Hackstall, there was a lot of sideways glances at the idea of Hackstall getting another chance after Philly, but he's done well. And the Seattle Kraken have done well. Grubauer's still their starter, and I would think with the way he played in the playoffs, he'll be their starter next season as well. But Seattle's an interesting one because they've done a good job of weaponizing their cap space, signing players that they've needed. I would expect this summer they go out and sign players and make some minor deals, and so we'll see where that ends up. But I would think the most likely to come off the board, I would say Florida is still the most likely. Nashville, I think, is still potentially second if they're able to have that bounce back. And then, yeah, Seattle might end up being third currently on the list. But let me know your thoughts on which team you think comes off the board next and which one's just cursed. They're not going to win it. And I'm going to give my vote to Vancouver because I've said for years now, since before I had a channel, this team will never win a Stanley Cup in my lifetime. I think I realized that in 2011. I think 2011 when they didn't get it done in Game 7 against Boston, I said, yeah, this is just never going to happen, is it? And then in 2012 when they were upset in the first round by the Kings, when they were President's Trophy winners, that was when it really, really hit home that, yeah, this is never going to happen. I'm never going to see a Stanley Cup in Vancouver, but we'll see if I'm right or wrong. So let me know why it's Buffalo, because I know there's going to be a lot of people picking Buffalo, and which one you think comes off the board next. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.